Thank you so much for being here. Greetings to the folks who are joining us by webcast. We have a terrific agenda for you today. And afterwards, if you want to share this experience or relive it yourself, we'll have a video posted online in a day or two. So feel free to look for that link on our website, brookings.edu, and share it with your associates. It's my sincere pleasure on behalf of the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center and the Cross Brookings Initiative on Energy and Climate to welcome you here today to consider this question: can tax reform include a carbon tax? My name is Adele Morris. I'm a senior fellow here in the Economic Studies program at Brookings. I'm also an affiliate with our Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center and with our Cross Brookings Initiative on Energy and Climate. And I'm the policy director of our Climate and Energy Economics Project. And so the perspective you'll hear from me as a card-carrying member of the dismal science profession. Those of you who know me and know my research, and I see lots of friends and associates here today, know that my research and that of my colleagues answers this question: can tax reform include a carbon tax? From an economic policy perspective, resoundingly in the affirmative. We know from the research, and this is in the peer-reviewed literature to which I contribute, that including a price on carbon as a revenue source is a sound and feasible way to accomplish other fiscal goals, including a fiscal reform package that might reduce tax rates on other revenue instruments. And we know this using a wide variety of analytical tools. We've got our computable general equilibrium models and our sophisticated input-output models. We look at experience of carbon pricing around the world and other economies. And I think that the consensus amongst my profession is very solid there. Now, you're going to hear from people who are in the political trenches, and so I'm not saying that a carbon tax is the most likely outcome of the current discussion of tax reform, and tax reform may not even be the most likely legislative vehicle for climate policy, including a tax reform. But, you know, my research doesn't put odds on that. We'll hear from the political professionals later. I think in addition to the research on pricing carbon, another compelling case arises, and that is that our tax system does need pro-growth, sensible reform. We need sensible, fiscally responsible amendments to our tax code to simplify it, make it more pro-growth, but doing so in a way that exacerbates the already unsustainable trajectory of our federal debt to GDP ratio is wholly irresponsible. Now, the details of a carbon tax matter, and that's why my research works on that. And I'm reminded, you know, I've been doing this now 20 years, as of like probably a month ago, 20 years working on climate policy, starting at the President's Council of Economic Advisors when we were analyzing the commitments we were discussing for the Kyoto Protocol. And so I've been at this a while now, both in government and now here at a research institution. And I'm fully convinced that we will not meaningfully address the challenge of climate disruption and ocean acidification without leveraging the power of market forces. And that's what the underlying insight of pricing carbon and other greenhouse gases is about. So just a couple quick shameless plugs for our research and coming attractions before I get on to our esteemed guests and our panel program. We're going to be releasing a paper in about the next few days that explores the linkages between climate change and monetary policy. We're looking at how climate policy can be optimized in its design from a monetary policy making perspective, and how monetary policy can be optimized with the kind of supply shocks to the economy that can be related to climate change. And also another shameless plug, not just from my work, but that of the Stanford Energy Modeling Forum. My co-chairs and I have assembled 11 amazing modeling teams to run coordinated scenarios of U.S. carbon tax, looking at different policy designs, different uses of the revenue with our general equilibrium models. And that will be appearing, that big multi-model study is going to come out, all goes well, in February in the peer-reviewed journal Climate Change Economics. So stay tuned for coming attractions. So I am delighted to welcome Representative John Larson of the 1st District of Connecticut here today. Not only is he a champion of climate change mitigation, but he is a champion of evidence-based policymaking, and you can see that in the design of his legislation. There's a direct connection between the evidence and power of our research and the way he's gone crafting the kind of legislation that he has proposed long since. So I'm going to introduce Representative Larson, and he's going to give his remarks, and we'll have some Q&A with him, and then we'll take some questions from the audience, and then we'll have our panel session to further delve into these issues. Now, Representative Larson, in addition to his leadership on climate, and I want to just point out, he is a member of several very important organizations within the Congress. First, he sits on the all-important House Ways and Means Committee, 2 very important subcommittees, including the Tax Policy Subcommittee and the Subcommittee on Social Security, of which he's the ranking member. He's also a member of the Climate Solutions Caucus, which is a bipartisan collection of lawmakers who have expressed their interest in resolving issues related to climate change. And a shout out to the good people of Citizen Climate Lobby for their work on that. Before his almost 20 years in Congress, he had a distinguished career in local and state policymaking. He was an educator and a small business owner, and he has championed the idea of a tax on carbon pollution as the most effective means to reduce emissions, and he has introduced recently the America Wins Act, which would use a carbon tax in part to fund $1 trillion of investment in the nation's infrastructure. So please join me in welcoming Representative Larson.
Wow. Well, thank you, Adele, and it's an honor to be here, and I look forward to hearing from our distinguished panelists as well. Let me say at the outset, I'm not an economist, I'm not a scientist, I'm a legislator, and I'm very proud of that, and I often refer to my legislative experience being one of very practical. And the source of my knowledge comes from a little mom and pop hot dog stand in East Hartford called Augie and Ray's, where I get most of my most unvarnished views about just about everything that goes on in Washington and around the country. And at Adele, when you were talking about posing the question before us, usually when you say something at Augie and Ray's and you say carbon tax, they look at you like, what? And so when we were talking about putting legislation forward, we decided that it's probably best to refer to this as something that people can get their arms around. So we call it a pollution tax. And we note that oftentimes in tax policies, we tax sinful things, whether it's cigarettes or alcohol. Why not pollution? So that the person at Augie and Ray's is able to say, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, tax something that's bad for my lungs, bad for my drinking water, something that can serve a common interest of everyone that's not confusing to me, and not that people don't understand carbon at Augie Ray's, but just that it's been my experience in legislating that what you want to do is to come up with a proposal that will allow people to get their arms around it. And that only includes people at Augie Ray's, but it also includes members of Congress. And so, especially since carbon tax has been more often than not demonized, that we thought, well, listen, why don't we put some language around a carbon tax that helps people better understand what our objective and goals are. And oh, by the way, what if we tied it to economic development? And as Adele was alluding to, whether you tied it to, we'll say, reducing taxes, or whether you tied it, in fact, to infrastructure improvement. Now, we chose infrastructure, and I'll tell you why. We have, again, a D-plus rating by engineers and scientists. We invest about 1.4% of our GDP in infrastructure. It's like the lowest it's ever been in our history. Conversely, China invests about 8.7% of its GDP in infrastructure. And in fact, if you travel around the world, and I'm sure many of you have, and you look how modernized the airport or the mass transit systems are, you got to scratch your head and say, what is wrong here in this country? And as I indicated, engineers and the Society of Engineers has given us a D-plus rating in infrastructure. We know as well from everybody who runs for office, whether it be the President of the United States or a member aspiring to the House or Senate, that we talk about the need for us to invest in our infrastructure. And then when it comes down to actually paying for it, we tend not to get serious. And we know that we need trillions of dollars, and we propose billions, and then we propose them in a catch-as-catch-can basis, and not comprehensive enough to deal with the major problems that we face. So that's why we introduced the America Wins Act. Winning seems to be a very prevalent thing in politics today. We hear our leaders talking about it frequently, but I think it's a good idea to engage leaders on that, especially those who have spoken about you're gonna love winning and keep seeing us win all the time and want to make America great again. Well, America can't be great again unless we improve our failing infrastructure system. And if America is going to be great again, it means its people have to be working. And one way to make sure that 22 million people get back to work is to have a massive infrastructure program. But of course, if you're a deficit hawk and you want to make sure that we're not going further into debt, you want to make sure that you can pay for this. And oh, by the way, if you've decided to get out of the Paris Accords because you think it's a bad deal and say you can produce something better, well, we've got a better deal. We've got a pollution tax initiative that will supersede the Paris Accords, that will put the country back to work. And then in terms of several of the downstream ramifications, whether it be those coal miners you addressed in West Virginia or Kentucky, or whether it be the rate shock that certainly people would see in their tax bills, there's a way to address these issues. There's a way in which we can comprehensively both move the nation forward, address deep and abiding concerns, even if you're somewhat skeptical about the science, you're not skeptical about pollution and what it does to the air we breathe and the water we drink. It's practical. It's common sense. it's straightforward. It goes to the crux of the matter so that when you're staring at the coal miner and telling him that there's going to be a future, that future includes making sure that the more than $100 billion shortfall in their pensions is going to be taken care of. And that he will have an opportunity, depending upon his age, to make the transition into like-minded industries, and that there would actually be money there for that transition, and whether it's the closing of mines or the further technical training or the transition that is needed, you're addressing that real and practical social concern that that individual has. And further, you also have the added benefit of knowing that you're going to be cleaning the environment, purifying the air, and making cleaner the water that we drink. So that's the whole concept. When Nancy Pelosi was Speaker, we also had a select committee that we formed in the House, and I had the opportunity to serve that. I can remember being in Greenwich, Connecticut, talking with a group of hedge fund members who Nancy and I were talking about fundraising with them. And they said, well, geez, we kind of find Mr. Larson's idea about a carbon tax interesting. And she said to them, ask Mr. Larson how many votes he has for his carbon tax amendment. And I proudly said, well, I got 3 right now. And that was the reality. And that, and so a notion of cap and trade was pitched as though, as Adele was alluding to, that somehow we could bring together the financial world and also the environmental world, and people who were deeply concerned about climate change. But then we all know what happened in late 2008 and 2009. And so with the recession and the Great Recession and crash that took place, so once again, this idea that no less than George David, the then chairman and CEO of United Technologies, has said to me, what we want and what the business community needs is certainty. Why doesn't Congress just come together with something that's common sense, like a carbon tax that's predictable and that we can price, and we can price downstream, and we could do it in a manner that, well, would be common sense. And then all the other ensuing ramifications, the rate shock, we can prepare for that and deal with that. And we can make it 2-tier. And we met with Bob Greenstein's group, who says, yeah, the one thing you can't do is leave the very poor amongst us, you know, facing enormous increases in their heating and cooling bills. That can be addressed. And also tax credits for the middle class so that we can work our way through this. But when you add to that the added incentive of rebuilding the country in the way it needs to be without further placing debt on another generation, to actually do something pretty unique in Congress, pay for it. And so here we find ourselves in a quandary that Adele points out at the outset. We're in the process of the Senate about to vote on a tax bill that, depending upon what they come up with, will either go to conference or, unlikely as it may sound, if they were to adopt the current House proposal. And we did that without a single public hearing, without a single expert witness, without anyone having the opportunity, in what we would commonly refer to as regular order, to review this. And so I think that's why you see the consternation. Now, it's all couched in the terms of saying, well, what we need now is a political win. Well, politically, maybe that's true, but isn't it truly what we need is for America to win? And aren't we long overdue to say, listen, as hard as it is, put the politics aside and say, what is it that we need to do to have the discipline to recognize our role in the world globally, our role for our own country and our citizens, and come up with a plan that will both fund the infrastructure development that we need and put people back to work and leave us with a cleaner environment in the process, superseding even the Paris Accords. So that's our simple legislation that we've put out there. And I have more than 3 sponsors, you know, and we're just getting started. I do think that there will be an opportunity here. I think we're going to have an opportunity to get 2 bites of the apple. I do think ultimately that Congress will do an infrastructure plan, and right now we have woeful little money to pay for it. I also think that this current scheme before Congress is incredibly flawed, you know, pitting people against one another and dividing the nation, blue state against red state, sick people against healthy people, you know, lower class against upper middle class. And it doesn't seem to make an awful lot of sense, I think, to most casual observers, but everyone kind of goes, well, that's Washington, and they don't seem to get it there. I think the trend is changing. If you look at the number of conservative Republicans that have been to the White House to talk about, although it would be revenue neutral, but to talk about a carbon tax, it's a pretty impressive list, from Jim Baker to George Shultz to Art Laffer, to name a few. And when you hear people like Lindsey Graham talking about, you know what, maybe it's time that we take a real serious look at this, and when you experience the fallout, as inevitably will occur once people actually get to see what's in this current tax reform bill, then I think there can be a very pragmatic, practical, nonpartisan, based on the science and the economics discussion in reality of what this would mean to initiate a tax on pollution. And with that, I'll turn it back to Del, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
So can you join me? Here, so, here, let's see, why don't you sit right there? Yeah.
Mary, I'm warming up your chair for you here.
Thank you, Representative Larson, for those remarks and for your leadership on the Ways and Means Committee and in Congress with your sensible, pragmatic, problem-solving attitude. Some of us still hold out affection for the quaint notion of pragmatic, bipartisan.
We'll settle for regular order. You know, that would be nice.
So you've been involved in climate policy discussions for many years now, and you spoke about the legislative efforts in 2008 and 2009. And as we're approaching almost the 10th anniversary of those conversations, what's your sense of how things have evolved? How have the politics and the sentiment around the climate change issue evolved, both kind of within the Democratic caucus and also your perception of where Republicans stand on these issues?
Well, you know, I do think it is. I think evolving is a good word. But let me say at the outset, because I know oftentimes when you come to a forum of this nature, and you wonder, you know, are people really listening to what we have to say? I'm an eternal optimist, and I really believe that in the heart of every member of Congress resides that individual that still believes that, you know, the vitality of ideas in a free and open society is important. And clearly, not being a scientist, not being an economist, when you listen to those who have dedicated their lives and have done the modeling and have looked at alternative means, of coming to a conclusion that would be in everyone's interest, people are desperate for that. The American people, even more so, are desperate for solutions. And I think sometimes there's a tendency in government to oversimplify a solution. And I'm not being critical here of the president. I actually think the president can come around to this very kind of thought, which he inadvertently expressed throughout his time on the campaign trail. How he was going to take care of the coal miners, how he was going to rebuild the infrastructure. And when he did not sign, albeit the only nation, I think, now that Syria is on board the Paris Accords, he said because he could create a better deal. Well, I think it's the obligation then to present him with the better deal. And I think we have it here. So I am hopeful from that perspective. And the need also to return to regular order. It'd be nice in a tax discussion that impacts 100% of the economy and 100% of the individuals to actually have experts there who are talking. I'm grateful for whatever I'm able to read and listen to and absorb as much as I can, but frankly, I'd rather be asking a lot of people like you the questions so that we could bring greater clarity. And then if there's need to move or compromise or adjust, to do so. That's what a democracy is about.
Amen. So, well, we have time for a couple audience questions before we need to move on to the panel discussion. Do we have somebody back with the microphone, so you can raise your hand? And a couple things. Please express your question as a question, and identify yourself and your affiliation if you have one. So, hands up. Yeah, that would be good. So we have folks watching on webcast and.
Hi, this is James Handley with the Carbon Tax Network. And I just want to say, good to see you again, Representative Larson. I consider you a climate hero. You introduced the most aggressive, briskly rising carbon tax that we'd ever seen in 2008, and it was actually easy to say and show that that bill would outperform the cap and trade measures that were being proposed at the time, which made it more comfortable for me to advocate that proposal because it was aggressive. It was going up briskly. I notice that your current proposal, the increment is only 2% a year, which doesn't hit the mark the way your earlier proposals did. I'm wondering why the change?
Well, actually, in sitting down, John Delaney is a good friend of mine. Also, he has a carbon tax initiative as well. His is at 4%, but it's also a much lower rate. And everybody else has kind of come in an attempt to build consensus. The other proposals that exist in the Senate are at the same percent and at a 2% growth. So the idea here, and we have co-sponsors in the Senate, was to bring more members on board. And so it was a very pragmatic decision, not one that couldn't be adjusted with expert witnesses, shall we say, in regular order, where we actually had a thorough discussion from both a scientific and economic standpoint, and then a real practical standpoint of this economic impact in terms of what it means for jobs. And when you want to boil it down to the Augie and Ray's person, he's not concerned about that 2%, or she. They're concerned about a job. And if we can't get that across to them, and if we remain aloft in our views and can't bring it down to that person so they understand it, then we can't get legislation through. Then we're not legislating, we're pontificating.
And by the way, I just wanted to say I really appreciate your comments about coalfield communities and coal workers, because I think it's really important that we recognize that achieving our environmental goals, there are going to be people who are impacted by that, and you've taken a really proactive stance in making sure that we're cognizant of that. And obviously those folks are already hurting owing to natural gas price dynamics and other factors, and so it seems like that provision is very timely.
I can remember a discussion with the union, and a gentleman said to me, "Do you think I like going down in the mines and exposing myself to black lung disease? And do you think I really like this?" He said, "But it pays the bills for my family. It's so that I'm giving them hope at the end of the day." And if we cut off their ability to have a pension that is $100 billion underfunded, and they have no idea when, their mines may be closed or not, or what cycle they might find themselves. I think as Americans, we have a responsibility to them. And I think it also gives a pragmatic way, just as it would the ratepayer who will deal with the obvious shock. We all know that any increase will be passed along. Well, let's mitigate that increase. Let's make sure that whether you're on a wellhead or whether you're in a coal mine, that you have an opportunity to transition, that your pension is secure, and you have an opportunity for another job in maybe a similar or related field. But the transition is built in, and minimally, you know that your pension is secure. And I think that's a fair deal and a fair shake. And they just, yeah, but will it be a reality? Only if we pursue it, and only if we keep pushing it. You can't, in this business, of course, persistency has great value. Look at how many in this room have been calling for a carbon tax initiative long before it was even a piece of legislation or an idea. It gets back to the vitality of ideas and getting them across, and then being able to translate them in a way that the coal miner can understand and appreciate that you're not trying to take his job away. You're trying, in fact, you'll do everything within your power to assist him and help him in that transition. And more importantly, depending upon how old he is, let him know that after a life in those mines, that, he's not going to wake up and find not only did he give up his life and hard work and expose himself to disease, but then he has no pension to boot as well. I think these are common sense ways of handling issues that are staring us right in the face. Okay. And I think Mr. Trump would be open to that as well, the president.
Okay, maybe one, yes, sir.
Congressman, I'm Reed Detchen with the United Nations Foundation, and I'm sympathetic with the folks at Augie and Ray's about how you described this. I wonder if you've thought and had interactions with your Republican colleagues about whether this could be not just a tax deal, but a pollution deal in the sense of reshaping the way we control pollution to use market mechanisms as they have often advocated and bring back the old expression, polluter pays.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And yes, I have had those conversations, and I daily will send them a list of Republican economists and well-respected former secretaries of the state who are also here. Let me say, but my pitch to them primarily has been around infrastructure. Bill Schuster, dear friend of mine, et cetera, he hasn't come out in favor of my tax proposal, but what he is in favor of is a robust infrastructure plan. Well, how are we going to get there? And I don't think anyone buys into the fact that there will be those that will say you can pay through it through dynamic scoring, but that will only take you so far. And the old saying, I may have been born at night, but not last night, that's what the person at Augie's is saying. They know if there isn't real money that's put out there for this, that there won't be the ensuing construction jobs that take place, or all we'd be doing is kicking the can down the road and saying some other generation pay for this. And the figure that I cited before, 1.4% of our GDP spent in infrastructure, China 8.7%. When you drive that message home, when you drive what should be a traditional conservative marketplace solution to a party that prides itself on that, you see them beginning to say, well, wait a minute. If this current plan, whether it breaks down or not, whether they go through with this or not, there's still going to be a need to do infrastructure. And there's going to be a need, and I'll say this about the president, he clings tenaciously to the things he said on a campaign and what he said in office. He said he was going to get a better deal than the Paris Accords because it wasn't a good deal. He said he was going to take care of those coal miners because he understood what they were going through and he was going to have a better deal for them. Well, we're giving the opportunity, and when I say we're, I think anyone that looks at the revenue that a carbon tax can bring in and then how you apply that revenue can readily see solutions that everybody can get their arms around.
Well, thank you so much, Congressman Larson. I'm just so delighted that you could join us here today. Please join me in thanking our guests.